When we think of the French Revolution, our minds jump straight to guillotines, right? To grand declarations and stormed barricades. And look, it was absolutely a revolution of ideas. But it was also something else. It was a revolution of logistics, a really physical struggle to stitch together a completely fragmented country into one single modern nation. So yeah, let's get into it.
So I want you to put yourself in their shoes for a second. It's 1789. You've just helped overthrow a monarchy that's been around for centuries. Now what? What's your first move? How do you actually turn these incredible ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, into a state that actually, functions? Do you start with a constitution? Do you raise an army?
You start with roads. Yeah, I know. It sounds almost boring, doesn't it? But for the revolutionaries, infrastructure wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was everything. It was the key to creating the very lifeblood of their new republic.
And the challenge they were facing, it was huge. In 1789, France had about 30,000 kilometers of roads that were actually usable. Now, for the revolutionaries who were totally inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, this network wasn't just a map. It was a blueprint for a brand new national market, a system that could finally unite the country economically.
See, before the revolution, France wasn't really a single economic unit. Not at all. It was more like a patchwork quilt of different regions, all choked by this crazy maze of internal tolls, weird local privileges, and actual physical barriers. It made moving anything, especially food, an absolute nightmare.
The revolutionaries had this incredibly powerful vision. They imagined the new nation as a living thing, a body politic. And in this metaphor, free-flowing commerce was the blood, and the roads and canals, those were the arteries. For anything to work, for the economy to boom, for new ideas to spread, for Paris to even eat, the nation's blood had to circulate freely. The arteries couldn't be clogged.
But here's the thing. Agreeing on the idea of free circulation, that was the easy part. Agreeing on how to actually manage it, that was a whole different story. This wasn't just a technical problem to be solved by engineers. It was a fierce ideological battle that turned neighbor against neighbor, city against countryside.
The whole debate really boiled down to two opposing teams. On one side, you had the liberals, people who followed thinkers like Turgot. Their mantra was simple: laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Let it be, let it pass. They truly believed that if you just let grain move freely, the market would regulate itself and you'd prevent famine. But on the other side were the protectionists. They followed a guy named Nicolas Delamare, and they were terrified that free trade would just let speculators buy up all the local grain and ship it away, leaving them to starve. Their solution? Public granaries, greniers d'abondance, to make sure local communities were fed first.
And this wasn't some abstract debate happening in Parisian salons. No, this played out on the ground, and it pitted the cities against the countryside. People in the cities, especially Paris, were desperate for cheap bread. They supported any policy that would bring grain in from anywhere and everywhere. But for farmers and people in small villages, seeing a cart loaded with grain from their own harvest heading off to some distant city was terrifying. It literally felt like their own survival was being carted away for somebody else's profit.
So the revolution's first attempt to fix all this was driven by pure idealism. They thought, okay, the problem is the powerful central government in Paris. Let's take that power away from the royal administration and give it back to the people, or, their local representatives.
And this idealistic plan collapsed with shocking speed. I mean, it happened so fast. In 1789, they got rid of the hated corvée. That was the old system of forcing peasants to do unpaid labor on royal roads. A huge symbolic win. But just 1 year later, after they handed control of the roads to the local departments, the entire network just started to fall apart. By 1792, it was a mess.
So why did it fail so badly, so quickly? Well, it was kind of a perfect storm. First, total financial chaos. The new revolutionary money, the assignat, was basically in free fall, making it impossible to pay anyone to fix anything. Second, a massive tax strike. With the old system gone, a lot of people just stopped paying taxes, which meant local governments had no money. And finally, you had petty local politics. You'd have departments literally refusing to maintain roads that connected to their neighbors, creating these huge gaps in the national network. The dream of one unified system was shattering into 83 little disconnected pieces.
And then, in the spring of 1792, everything changed. France declared war on Austria, and all of a sudden, those abstract debates about economics became a very, very real crisis of national survival.
The road problem was no longer about getting grain to the market, it was about getting cannons to the front line.
The liberal dream of a commercial paradise just evaporated, replaced by the brutal, urgent necessity of military logistics.
The entire goal of the road network shifted almost overnight. Before 1792, the big question was, how can our roads make us wealthy? After 1792, the question was, how can our roads help us win this war? It was that simple.
And just listen to this quote from Michel Leconte Puyraveau. He was a member of the National Convention at the time. He's not talking about the flow of commerce or grain. He's talking about the flow of armies, munitions of war and mouth. That means cannons and food. For the soldiers, the purpose of the roads was now crystal clear. Serve the war machine.
So, facing military disaster and the collapse of the country from within, the radical phase of the revolution takes over. The central government, led by the infamous Committee of Public Safety, seized control. That whole idealistic experiment in decentralization, yeah, that was over.
Their new tool was the requisition. This was basically a demand for anything and everything the army needed. Labor, carts, horses, building materials, you name it. Now, they were very careful to try and distinguish this from the old, hated corvée. They insisted this was a paid, patriotic duty, not unpaid slave labor. But in reality, with the currency being worthless, that distinction was pretty academic.
I mean, the contrast between the two systems is just night and day. The decentralized approach from 1790 to 92, it was locally funded, locally managed, and a complete and utter failure. This new centralized system after 93, it was state-funded, directed by the Committee of Public Safety, and ruthlessly enforced by these requisitions. It was brutal, for sure, but it worked.
And to sell this, let's be honest, forced labor to the public, the government got really creative with its PR. Take the Dordogne, for example. The representative there didn't just order people to go fix the roads. No, he organized a 3-day Festival of Equality, where citizens would come out to perform revolutionary work. It was a genius piece of propaganda, turning backbreaking labor into a patriotic party.
So after all this chaos, all this violence and desperation and struggling over France's roads, what was the end result? What kind of nation did they actually end up building?
Well, in the end, that initial liberal dream of a perfectly free, decentralized market, it failed. It was just crushed by local fears, financial chaos, and ultimately by war. But here's the paradox. The brutal necessities of that war achieved what idealism never could. It forged a highly centralized, strategic road network, all controlled from Paris. A network designed for armies that would become the very foundation of Napoleon's modern, centralized French state.
There's a really deep irony in this whole story, isn't there? The revolution started with this grand vision of freeing the movement of goods and people from the chains of the old monarchy. But to build the very arteries of that freedom, they had to resort to immense state power and coercion. It just goes to show you, the roads to liberty are often paved with force.